All right, just make sure you guys can hear me. So, as you guys can see, presentation title is The Rise and Fall of the Year 2022. I think all of us can relate that 2022 was a little bit rough, got a little shaky, right? I went through a lot of experiences, a lot of learning lessons that I'm grateful for because I know it's prepared me for my journey in business, and so I actually want to share some of that stuff with you guys. So just to do a quick introduction, obviously out of Atlanta market, we're also planning on expanding out into Dallas this month. Niche is wholesale, hotel, and creative finance. My strengths, sales psychology, leadership, and recruiting. Misspelled recruiting, my bad, guys. I didn't say spelling, right? But anyway, so recruiting ties into both 1 and 2. So quick bio, I'm 23 years old, born in Florida, raised in Georgia, first generation immigrant. My parents are from Haiti. I started real estate when I was 19 years old, did my first flip. That was like subject to creative finance, and I haven't looked back ever since. So my give. And I took a lot of time to think about this, and the conclusion about this was my last meeting when I was talking to somebody in TG, and they're like, hey, like you should do a presentation on this. But even outside of this, so my give is how to overcome and have the mindset and business frame of how to deal with failure in business and in life. Because what I've realized is that we all are going to deal with failure or we dealt with failure, right? And at the end of the day, there's times where we failed in business or we're gonna fail in a relationship. You're gonna fail showing up as a parent. You're gonna fail showing up as a brother, as a sister, as a wife, as a husband. And what I've realized is that all of that affects how you move in life, right? And so what I've had to learn is last year, I failed. I failed miserably in a number of aspects, but then I also learned and I grew from it too. But then also, in the time of me going through what I had to go through, I actually sat back and I reflected, okay, after I had overcame all the things I had to deal with, I looked back and I said, okay, how can I share this with other people so that they don't have to go through what I went through, or they're able to still bounce back? Because by the grace of God, I will say that I was able to bounce back. Our business we still completed the year at over $1 million, but man, did we go through it. So just to get into it. So right here is a little bit of a team photo. That's actually my team photo. That's me and my team in January 2022. At that time, that quarter, we did over $500,000 in revenue in one quarter, at over 18 employees, in-state and a combination of overseas. And I thought I found the love of my life, right? And she actually became my COO at the time too. I thought I was on top of the world. So when things started to take a turn, so obviously I think everybody felt the interest rates, right? Kind of shifted. It got a couple of us shaking a little bit. I was sitting on a couple of properties that I got stuck with. Dysfunction began to take over my business. So a huge thing that started to happen was miscommunication, right? And it started from a leadership standpoint of where communicating with my leadership team and just another message would just pass along to my team, right? And so the frustration I started to get frustrated a lot. And which also leads into my next thing is that I started to make bad hires. If you could take away from this, is how intentional you have to be when it comes to hiring employees. Don Winter has a great book, and what I learned is that when it comes to hiring one role, you want to be able to at least devote 20 to 40 hours to filling that one role, because one bad employee can cost you over $50,000 in either projected lost revenue or actual lost revenue. I actually lost money. So I felt the burn, right? Relationships starting to fall apart. And this actually ties into a big thing about what I'm going to talk about in the presentation, which was the business started to get into this, and then this started to get into the business, right? And there'd be moments where me not showing up in my relationship would cause us to argue even at the morning before I have to go into a meeting with the team, right? And how am I supposed to be able to lead the team when I'm still pissed off about the Instagram? We were arguing about Instagram or something like that, you know? But at the end of the day, it's just little things, right? And a huge thing which I really had to learn and really reflect on, was that I started to make business decisions out of emotions, right? And I think that was a huge learning lesson that I had to go through. So just to kind of show you guys, so we talk about the crash and the burn, right? So at that time, I started to have like negative months. I remember one month we were negative $70,000. I took a loss on 2 different properties. My relationship began to fall apart. I had to step away from that. And really, I got to the point to where when I made the decision to shut down, it wasn't because of finances or anything of that nature. It was because I could not show up mentally as a leader anymore. I would literally come up to a team meeting and they would ask Jacques, what should we do? And I literally said, whatever you guys want to do. And that's when one of my team members came to me and said, hey, like, listen, I've never seen you mentally show up like this. He's like, I think you need to step away. And so I was like, you're right. I was like, so it was a huge, tough decision. And I remember the meeting that we had when I had to shut everything down. And at that point, I remember just feeling like, man, did I fail? You know, especially after I had just came from CG2 in May, and I'm just like, man, yeah, we're killing it, right? Like, I mean, and so in those moments of when 2 months later I had to go through a shutdown, and all I could think about, which was a little bit, right, which is gonna lead into a post-shutdown, but all I could think about was like, man, I'm a fraud. Right? Like, I'm not the person I thought I was. And I remember Jimmy, I'm not sure if you remember this, but I asked you a question last year at the first meeting I showed up, and I asked you a question after your presentation. I said, Jimmy, how do you separate your identity from the business? And I remember you had told me, like, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. But in that moment, being prescribed an identity to my business, right? Because even in my market, like, I've been known as this kid who's killing it. Right, so when you're sitting there and you're not the kid who's killing it anymore, I sat there like, who am I? Right, and I realized that's the thing that's going to affect a lot of us as business owners, because we're known in our market, right, individually, and we know that we're measured by the results that we produce, right? But what happens when you're not producing results? Who are you then? Right, because you're still going to be the father that you are, you're still going to be the wife that you are, you're still going to be the husband that you are, right? Outside of that, and so, but during that time, I had gone through 30 days of straight frustration, depression, and regret. I lost 15 pounds, I broke up with my girlfriend, and I watched a lot of Netflix. But here's what I will say about the Netflix part, though. Hold on, let me explain this, right? So I watched the show Narcos like crazy. And what most people call Netflix binging, I would call it business discovery. Okay, so hear me out here. So as I actually took a lot of, believe it or not, I took a lot of lessons from watching that show. And granted, like, outside of just, like, you know, what they do like a day-to-day, I also just looked at how they run their organizations. And here's a big takeaway that I started to realize that I didn't have, was that even when you have like the Don of the organization, he had his right hands, his A players, who could execute on a high level. And then I started to realize is that with me having 18 employees, and the majority of that, I actually had 6 to 7 who actually contributed and produced what we needed to do. And it was a huge shift to where, and I think sometimes we get caught in the vanity of having large organizations. But I realized I would rather have 3 bad wolves than 10 okay people, right? And so that was a huge perspective shift for me. I was like, man, did I mess up? I got so caught up in the vanity of having a large team, and I started to look back, like, who are my producers? I was like, man, it was only 6 to 7 of them, right, that I needed. So, lessons that I've learned. So, in the grand scheme of life, business means this much. And that was something that I really, really, really learned, that it really does means this much. Because again, when we talk about how you show up for your family, your friends, your relationships, for your team, the impact that you make on this world. The business does not define who you are as a person. If this goes to zero, you got to ask yourself, who am I without this? Right? And I think I encourage everybody to sit and ask yourself, like, who am I going to be if this goes to zero? Because there's a lot of times where you see the CEOs of successful companies that go to zero and they commit suicide. Right? And the people ask, like, they had all this money. They still had money left over, right? But they still commit suicide. And so that's another thing that I encourage you guys. But another lesson, too, is that everything starts with you and ends with you. How your organization goes, how your relationships go, everything literally starts with you. And that was a reflection I had, was that, man, I had blamed everybody else until I got to the point to where, like, I was in a meeting and I was like, you know what, like, I was the one that fucked up. I was like, it was me. I had blamed everybody else and I resented everybody else, but it was me. And I realized once I accepted that it was me, things started to change because I started to change myself. And again, so being a leader starts with how you show for yourself, your family, your spouse, and then your team and your employees, because how you conduct yourself outside the business is going to affect how you conduct yourself within business too. And I think a lot of us, and you guys can sit here and think about it too, like, how many times did you prioritize the business over your family, your relationship, right? And then ask yourself, when I got off of work, how did the conversation go? Did you have peace at home? No, you were arguing, right? You were in chaos. And then you go escape to the business again, right? Then what happens when that relationship fails? How are you going to show for work the next day, right? So you have to ask yourself, at the end of the day, we chose to build this kingdom, right? And we wear the crown. And Jason says it best, heavy is the head that wears the crown, right? This is a burden that we've chose to carry, and understand that this is your burden, and you have to lead, and you have to stand strong with this burden, right?
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to pull something out that you brought out that's gold. And so, do you want to know what the absolute worst thing about owning a business is? Anybody? It's your fault. Like, I hate it. Like, something adverse will happen, and they're like, "That's on the bitch." And I want to start pointing fingers, and it's like, no, it's on me. So, in the Rangers, like, the most painful lesson I had to learn was, I was responsible for everything that happens or fails to happen in my platoon. And, I was probably 22 the first time I heard it, and I'm 43 now, and I'm still just like, as soon as you get past the anger, it's like, I'm responsible for everything. Like, that's the burden of leadership. Who here has read Extreme Ownership? Like, that is like, every great basketball player has to shoot 10 free throws. What I have found that I just treat it like free throws. I have to remind myself everything that happens or fails to happen is my responsibility. And that will, if you're getting that rapid feedback mechanism and learning from your mistakes fast instead of blaming people, your growth will skyrocket. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted you pulled out gold there. Great work.
I appreciate it. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and speed through for you guys too.
And then I'll make up the 2 minutes I just stole from you, so don't worry about it.
Okay, perfect. So I want to say too, stress, I want you guys to understand this, but stress is a necessary catalyst for growth and change in your life. And this is actually something I had to learn that one of my mentors taught me, was that, if you guys never learned this, but look at some of the most stressful moments that you've had in the past 3 years of your life, and go back 3 years, right? And ask yourself this: if I was in that same position, in that situation that had caused me to break down, would I react the same way now, the way that I am now? And what people don't realize is that the same way that the body and how we grow muscles, right, is the process of growing muscles, is that you have to tear the muscle and the body reheals itself, and that's how the muscles become bigger. Your mind works the same exact way. It's called mental elasticity, right? Your brain has to go through stressful situations to learn how to adapt and change. And so the best analogy I can have for this is that the man who can handle the stress of 1,000 employees is going to be more successful than a man who cannot handle the stress of 10. And so that was a big thing, was that I had to learn how to embrace stress, right? So that was a huge thing. And then my last point, more doesn't always mean more. A small team of A players can outproduce a large team of B's and C's. Always remember that. So tying into this, do not tie your self-worth and identity to the results of your business. Here's another thing, too, that I really, really learned was do not hesitate to make the tough decisions. Waiting makes the situation worse, and you have to deal with the consequences of your inaction, right? Your inability to fire that employee that you need to fire. You know deep down in your gut you need to fire them. Oh, Lord, did I feel that? And I think a lot of us has felt that, right? Or your inaction to sit down and have the discipline to look at your finances, right? Then you crash and burn. So there's a lot of things, right? Do not be afraid to be vulnerable and ask for help. There are people around you who genuinely want the best for you. You guys are within the best group of people, and I did not tap into the circle. That was one thing I did not. I did not call Leon. I didn't text anybody because I had said, like, you know what, I just feel I'm too embarrassed to go reach out. But I remember the day that I shared my story about shutting down, I literally had 100 people reach out, even guys that I look up to in business reach out and said, hey, if you need anything, let me know. And me being vulnerable. So that was something that I had to learn. And then the last point, which is always show up regardless of if you feel like it or not. Show up for yourself first, then your family, and then your team. Show up. If you give your word to show up, just do it. I promise you. It's gonna, in those moments where you don't want to show up and you're just like mentally telling yourself, it's gonna be worth it, because again, you don't have to deal with the stress and the feedback of that promise that you didn't keep with your kid, right? You tell them that you're gonna go to the game and you were too tired from work, and look at how it's gonna affect your kid on a long-term picture too. Now, I actually want to give you guys actionable steps to overcome failure as well. So, one thing is accept your feelings and emotions and learn to give yourself grace. So a big message I had to tell myself when I failed, and like I said, everybody's going to fail in this room. There's a reason why I wanted to present on this, because you guys are going to fail at something. It may not be business, but it's going to be something. And at the end of the day, I want to know that each one of you have the tools that necessary to be able to overcome that, but give yourself grace. Learn to understand, learn to sit there and say, you know what, I fucked up, I messed up, but at the end of the day, that doesn't define who I am, and I'm gonna learn from this, right? Being able to sit there and say that as a man or a woman is gonna make a huge difference. And actually understand that failure does not mean your life is over. In fact, it's necessary to become better in life and business. Kevin O'Leary, which you guys know who Kevin O'Leary is, right? Shark Tank investor. He has said that he prefers to invest into entrepreneurs who have actually felt the pain of failure because he knows it makes them better. He literally says, I would rather give my money to somebody who's failed than somebody who hasn't, right? So what does that say about failure? It does not matter what aspect of life you fail in business, relationships, or life, treat it as a tool to learn from. Always be able to sit back and reflect and learn. What did I learn? How do I grow? How to become better? And how do I not let this happen again? That's a huge thing. Another thing, find inspiration. So I had to take myself outside of my current environment, and I remember I had gone to Tiffany and Josh High's event. I took a trip, being intentional with letting everything go. I just wanted to be present. I still didn't even have the business at the time. I was just there. But with letting everything go to masterminds and be vulnerable about your experience of the situation. I remember when I was talking to Tiffany and Josh, and even Tiffany was sharing, she's like, I literally went through the same thing that you went through. She's like, that's the reason why I have this now, because I literally did the same crash and burn that you did. And when I heard that, it actually it made me feel better about myself. Not because it's like, okay, well, somebody went through the same thing, but more so like I saw that she overcame it, right? And here's another thing that I want you guys to have a really good perspective shift. I know some of us are younger, some of us are a little bit earlier in our careers than the guys in Premier. The guys in Premier have long established businesses. But here's the thing, right? Understand that life in business is a marathon, not a sprint. Fortune 500 companies can have bad months and not feel it, right? And they can literally have bad years right? But they understand that they're building their companies to last decades. Because I had to have a shift in perspective, and I remember a mentor had this conversation with me. He's like, at the end of the day, Jacques, you have to build your business with the intention of it lasting 5 to 10 years. Because then you'll understand that one bad month out of 120 is very, very granular. And so what I had to learn was like shift my perspective, and that's how wealthy people look at things, right? Wealthy people look at, how can I build this to last 100 years? So when something goes bad on a day-to-day basis, they're not actually concerned about it, because they're like, listen, like, I'm building this with the intention of it lasting outside of me as a person. And then the last point is surround yourself with positive people. Spending time alone with your negative thoughts and negative people will do nothing good for you. Find a community, find your family. If you're ever at this point, find somebody you can rely on. So just to finish off, my ask is that for each one of you, I think right now my biggest focus is just still maintaining and sustaining, so I don't really need to grow. My ask is that for each one of you to establish an identity of who you are outside of business, right? And ask yourself, how are you gonna show up for anything else in all aspects of your life outside of business? Because again, in the grand scheme of life, business means this much.
What's that?
Do I need to answer questions or no?
Hey, you got time for questions?
You guys got questions?
You got lots of questions?
I don't have a question, but I just got some, like, I feel where you come from, and we talked about this before. I probably took the biggest L outside of what he's talking about, which I'm not going to share because I don't not share it, but that's just not what my presentation is about. But I thought about that, and then one thing I can just say, you kind of put it in your slide, is like me and Matt was talking about it yesterday, like, what did you learn from that? Not just for you, but for anybody that's taking it. What can you learn from those skills that you take? Because there's always a lesson.